Ilara Monroe stood frozen, her breath catching as her eyes locked on the crumpled eviction notice taped crookedly to her apartment door. Its red letters screaming louder than any knock ever could. Her hands trembled as if the paper itself carried the weight of every failure she'd tried so hard to outrun. The hallway smelled faintly of bleach and regret, the cracked linoleum floors echoing the hollowness in her chest as the peeling paint on the walls seemed to curl away from her like judgmental whispers. $2,400 in 3 days, an amount so small to some, but to her it felt like a mountain built from every broken promise and closed door she'd encountered in the last year. Just months ago, she'd been painting in sunlit rooms with hopes as wide as the sky. Now her dreams lay folded inside a sketchbook she could barely bring herself to open. The job she'd poured her soul into at the gallery vanished overnight after a theft scandal. One she didn't cause but got swallowed into like a shadow nobody cared to separate. She was collateral damage in someone else's crime, and the owners didn't even offer her a chance to explain. Just a final paycheck that barely covered groceries. Her mother, once a vibrant woman with wild curls and warm laughter, had begun forgetting her own birthday, her daughter's name, and the smell of cinnamon pancakes they used to make every Sunday. With no siblings, no father, and no savings, Ilara had become nurse, daughter, breadwinner, and emotional punching bag, all while pretending she was fine. Her boyfriend Liam, the one who had whispered forever beneath Christmas lights just last year, had vanished after her mother's diagnosis, like a coward fleeing a fire he helped spark. She hadn't cried when he left. She had simply stared at the empty space on the couch where his jacket used to hang and wondered if she had ever been truly loved at all. The silence in her apartment had grown heavier since then, less like peace, more like punishment. Her sketchbook became her only companion, its worn pages filled with charcoal sketches of dreams she no longer dared to speak aloud, each one a cry for freedom that never quite reached the world. Her landlord's warnings had turned from polite to cold over time, and today that final notice was the blade she always saw coming but couldn't dodge. She sat on the edge of her worn mattress, phone pressed against her ear, as she stared blankly at the faded calendar that mocked her with its list of unpaid bills and maybe tomorrows. That's when her phone buzzed again, a sharp vibration that startled her out of despair. The screen lit up with a name she didn't recognize, Hale Holdings, and something in her gut twisted. She answered hesitantly, bracing herself for another bill collector, but the voice on the other end was calm, clipped, professional. Ms. Monroe, Mr. Grayson Hale would like to meet with you regarding your application to the Hale Artistic Fellowship. Ilara blinked. That application was months old, sent with trembling fingers and little hope. Just another envelope tossed into the black hole of big-name foundations that rarely looked twice at nobodies like her. The assistant continued, offering an address in Manhattan in a time, tomorrow at noon. Sharp. Her heart thudded so loudly she was sure the walls could hear it. She almost asked if this was a mistake. She almost hung up, assuming it had to be. But something made her say yes. A flicker of the old Ilara, the one who used to believe that good things could still find her. After the call ended, she stood in the center of her tiny studio apartment and looked around as if seeing it for the last time. Her mother's pill organizer sat neatly on the kitchen counter. A cracked mug held 3 fading paintbrushes. Her favorite boots had a rip in the sole, but she decided they'd have to do. She didn't have money for a cab, or a new outfit, or even breakfast that morning. But she had one chance. A name she'd only heard in art circles, whispered like legend. Grayson Hale, a man known more for his cold investments than for personal warmth. The public called him reclusive, brilliant, unreachable. Rumors swirled that he only helped artists he could control. Others said he never gave interviews, never did charity, never cared. And yet for some reason, he wanted to see her. Ilara tucked her sketchbook under her arm like armor, the soft leather cover worn from nights spent tracing dreams in pencil under flickering light. Tomorrow she'd walk into the office of a man who had the power to erase her desperation, or deepen it. She had no expectations, no backup plan, no safety net. Just a name, a time, and a single breath of hope that maybe, just maybe, life wasn't done with her yet. The next morning, Alara stepped into the towering building like a ghost in a dream she didn't dare believe was real. Her boots clicking softly on the marble as she was led through sleek hallways of glass and chrome, where everything gleamed with the kind of wealth that didn't apologize. When the elevator doors slid open to the top floor, she was greeted by silence, an expensive kind of silence, padded with power and coldness, and seated in an office that overlooked the pulse of Manhattan as if the city itself bowed to the man who owned it. Grayson Hale stood by the window, back turned, his tailored charcoal suit framing shoulders too precise to be accidental. When he finally turned, Ilara was struck not by his fame, but by the sheer gravity in his ice-blue eyes, eyes that carried storms and secrets, and a distance that made the room feel colder than it was. He didn't speak immediately, just gestured for her portfolio with an almost clinical motion, his expression unreadable as he flipped through pages of her heart disguised as sketches, fingers pausing on certain pieces like he knew exactly what they meant but wouldn't dare say so. The longer he remained silent, the more Ilara felt like a mistake pressed between the pages of her own life, until finally he looked up. "You have raw talent," he said, his voice low and polished like steel. "But talent doesn't pay rent." The words hit her like a slap wrapped in silk. Her face flushed, both with shame and anger, her jaw tightening as she replied, "I didn't come here for charity." His gaze didn't flinch. "Good," he replied coolly, leaning back in his chair, fingers steepled like a man accustomed to control. "Because what I'm offering you isn't charity. It's a transaction." Her heartbeat stuttered. The words sounded clinical, soulless, but he continued before she could speak. "One night," he said, and her breath caught. "Not what you're imagining. Don't flatter yourself. I need someone to accompany me to a family dinner. My mother believes I'm engaged. If you can play the role for one evening, convincingly, I'll pay your rent for the next 6 months. No strings, no questions." Alara stared at him, blinking, trying to decipher whether this was insanity or opportunity wrapped in a strange disguise. "You want me to pretend to be your fiancé?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper, unsure if she should laugh, scream, or run. "Yes," he said simply, like he was offering her a cab ride, not a 6-month lease on survival. "You'll wear the ring, make small talk, smile on cue. My mother gets her illusion, and you walk out with stability. We never have to see each other again." Her pride screamed against the idea, begged her to walk out to keep her dignity. But then her reality answered. The eviction notice, her mother's rising prescriptions, the empty fridge, the unpaid hospital bills. "Why me?" she asked, not hiding the suspicion in her tone. "You're an artist," he replied flatly. "You know how to perform." The insult was subtle, but she let it go. "And if I mess it up?" she challenged. "You won't," he said with cool confidence, like he already knew the ending. The room went quiet again, thick with tension and something else, something undefined. Ilara's hands gripped the edge of the chair, knuckles white. The girl who believed in fairy tales was long dead. The woman sitting here knew deals often came with a price, but she also knew survival wasn't a clean game. Slowly, deliberately, she nodded. "Fine. One night." Grayson rose, extended his hand, and when she took it, something electric passed between them. Not romantic, not yet, but unsettling, like a silent understanding that they were stepping into a pact neither fully grasped. "Wear something elegant," he said. "My driver will pick you up at 7. As she left the office, the city's noise rushed in like a wave, and she leaned against the elevator wall, dizzy with disbelief. She'd walked in expecting rejection or silence, but instead walked out with an arrangement that felt like stepping onto a stage where the script hadn't been written yet. Her fingers clutched her bag tighter, thoughts racing with 1,000 versions of how this could end. There were no guarantees, only a contract made with eye contact and desperation. As the elevator doors closed, she caught one last glimpse of Grayson's silhouette through the glass wall, still standing, still unreadable, like a king orchestrating a play only he could see the ending of. And in that moment, Ilara realized something terrifying. This deal might solve her problems, but it could also unravel everything she'd fought so hard to hold together. At precisely 7, A black car swept Alara through the city's gilded arteries, climbing higher into the kind of neighborhoods that had gates, guards, and secrets polished to perfection. By the time she reached the Hale estate, her nerves were wrapped so tightly they hummed in her veins. The mansion loomed like a cathedral carved from old money, each window glowing with warmth that didn't match the frost in the air, while marble lions flanked the grand staircase as if daring her to step into their den. Inside, the home breathed wealth with every inch. Chandeliers glittering like icicles, gold-threaded rugs that swallowed her footsteps, and portraits of ancestors who had ruled empires of oil, steel, and scandal. A staff member in white gloves handed her a flute of champagne she barely sipped, too aware of how the silk emerald gown, borrowed from wardrobe and tailored in a rush, clung to her frame like expectation. Grayson stood beside her, impossibly poised in a dark suit, every inch the heir of his empire, his fingers laced through hers in a gesture that felt rehearsed yet oddly grounding. "They'll smell fear," he had warned her on the ride over, and now as they stepped into the ballroom, she understood what he meant. Vivian Hale was seated at the head of a candlelit table like a monarch surveying peasants, silver hair sculpted to perfection, lips painted in judgment, and eyes that gleamed with centuries of contempt. "Elara Monroe," she said coolly, as if testing the name on her tongue. "Grayson's fiancée." Her tone made the words sound like a disease. Elara smiled politely, offered a soft greeting, but Vivian didn't smile back. Instead, she studied her like one studies a forged painting, searching for cracks in the canvas. Throughout dinner, the questions came laced with sugar and venom. Where had she studied? Did her family own anything notable? Was she aware of how demanding a Hale marriage could be? Each bite of roasted duck felt like swallowing knives, and Grayson remained mostly silent, offering a squeeze of her hand under the table now and then, but not stepping in. Perhaps because this was the test, and Alara was expected to survive it alone. Then the atmosphere shifted, a current of discomfort rippling as the doors opened without warning. And in swept Miranda Dane, radiant, uninvited, and wearing a gown stitched from power. "So," she drawled, her smile sharpened with malice, "you've replaced me with her?" Her gaze raked over Alara like she was dirt dragged in on expensive heels, and the tension in the room thickened as Grayson's jaw clenched for the first time all night. Alara's fingers tightened around her champagne glass, but she didn't respond. She simply excused herself with quiet grace, letting the walls swallow her as she walked through French doors into the sprawling garden beyond. The night air hit her like truth, cool, fresh, and merciless, as she stood among manicured hedges and stone fountains, blinking back the shame clinging to her ribs. She shouldn't have come. This wasn't her world, and no gown or backstory could disguise that. Just as her fingers brushed her cheeks, wiping away a single treacherous tear, footsteps approached behind her. "You handled that well," came Grayson's voice, softer, more human than before. She turned, surprised to find warmth where there had once only been ice. "I wasn't expecting an ambush," she said quietly, her voice breaking just enough to betray the hurt. "Are we done pretending?" she asked, her heart pounding like it had been waiting for an exit since the moment she stepped into that ballroom. He looked at her then, not with scrutiny, but with something deeper, as if he was searching for a truth he hadn't realized he needed. "I don't know," he said slowly, voice raw in a way she hadn't heard before. "Maybe pretending is the only thing that feels real anymore." Silence fell between them, not uncomfortable but delicate, like a fragile thread being rewoven in the dark. Behind them, the lights of the estate glowed like judgment, but out here, under the stars, something shifted, something unspoken, tethered to the aching vulnerability neither of them dared to name. The following morning, the fragile silence between Alara and Grayson shattered like thin glass beneath the weight of 1,000 camera flashes. A single photo, her in his arms beneath the garden lights, had made its way onto the internet, and by noon they were trending on every platform imaginable. Headlines spun wild tales of secret weddings, heiress scandals, and whirlwind romances, none of which she recognized as her truth, yet they followed her like ghosts. Her phone buzzed relentlessly, vibrating with messages from classmates she hadn't spoken to in years, distant relatives now suddenly proud, and strangers asking what brand her dress was. Even her estranged father, absent since she was 10, left a voicemail, saying he was proud and knew she'd make it someday, as if success were the cure for abandonment. Every part of her life was now exposed, twisted, and speculated upon. And still Grayson remained as composed as ever, calmly guiding her through the storm like it was just another merger. But behind his calm, something darker lingered. Something she couldn't name until that night when the mansion felt too quiet, too still, and curiosity pulled her down a hallway, lined with expensive art and doors that whispered secrets. She hadn't meant to snoop. She only meant to find air. But when she reached his private study and found it ajar, the urge to understand the man behind the mask overtook her. The room was dim, heavy with old wood and masculine silence. But then, there it was. A canvas leaned against the far wall. Her painting, one she had sketched on cheap canvas in a borrowed studio 4 years ago. One she had sold in desperation to keep the lights on, never imagining she'd see it again. She approached it slowly, heart thundering, fingertips trembling as she touched the rough edges. And that's when she noticed the envelope tucked beside it, yellowed, handwritten, and sealed with a faint smudge of paint. Against her better judgment, she opened it, and the words inside broke something deep within her. It was a letter from Grayson's late sister, Ava Hale. She wrote of a girl she'd met at a Brooklyn coffee shop, a girl with ink-stained fingers and eyes like spring rain, who had given her free art lessons during a time when her mind had turned against her. She called her an angel who never asked for thanks, who taught her how to breathe through the brushstrokes when medication couldn't. She ended the letter with a name, Ilara Monroe. The floor seemed to sway beneath her feet as realization struck like lightning. Grayson had known who she was all along. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't chance. It was a secret built on silence. She waited until he returned, her expression unreadable, letter folded neatly in her trembling hands. When he walked through the door and saw her holding it, something in his eyes flickered. Guilt, sorrow, something far more raw than either. "You knew," she said quietly, not asking but accusing. He didn't deny it. "You knew who I was before that interview. You knew what I meant to her." His jaw clenched. "Yes." Her heart splintered. "So this was pity? A planned rescue? Some twisted thank you gift for teaching your sister how to paint while you disappeared behind money and titles?" Her voice cracked, thick with betrayal. He stepped closer, eyes begging her to hear what words never could. "I didn't plan to meet you like that. I didn't plan any of this." "But you didn't stop it," she snapped. "You didn't tell me." Silence roared louder than any excuse. "You pitied me," she whispered, the words tasting like rust. "You played me." His voice broke the quiet like thunder. "I was protecting you. You were the only light left in a darkness I didn't know how to survive." She stared at him, at the man who had offered her salvation in exchange for a performance, at the man who had watched her break without ever offering truth. "But you let me believe it was real," she said, more to herself than to him. Her hands dropped the letter. Her feet moved before her mind could stop them. She walked past him, past the hallway of lies, out into the rain that had begun to fall, like the sky had finally decided to weep for her too. And this time she didn't look back. She left the keys, the gowns, the warmth, and the man who claimed to be her rescue but became her ruin. Rain clung to Alara's skin like the ache she hadn't been able to shake since the night she walked away. Her body soaked as she stood across from the small art gallery she used to sketch in the margins of her notebooks. A place she once called a dream, now just a ghost behind fogged-up windows. Weeks had passed since the Hale mansion and its secrets, yet the memory of Grayson lingered in every brushstroke she made, in every silent moment when she thought she'd finally buried what he'd broken. She had convinced herself she was fine, woke up every morning, paid her mother's bills, painted quietly in borrowed corners of coffee shops, but the wound of knowing someone had loved her in silence, without courage, was a scar that pulsed even when she smiled. The sky above was the color of ashes, heavy with unshed tears, and the sidewalk was empty, until it wasn't. She turned at the sound of footsteps, heart skipping before her eyes even confirmed what her soul had already guessed. Grayson stood in the downpour, rain matting his hair, suit soaked through, and in his hands a small velvet box barely protected from the storm. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, but his eyes, those blue storm-churned eyes, were clearer than she'd ever seen them. "I didn't come here to fix things," he said, voice low, no theatrics, just truth etched into every syllable. "Because I broke them. I broke you." Her breath caught, but she didn't speak. She needed to hear it all. "But if there's one truth I've found," he continued, taking a step closer, "it's you. You are the only truth I ever had." She turned her face away, fighting the quake in her throat, the tears threatening her resolve. "Truth doesn't erase pain," she whispered. He nodded slowly. "I know. I'm not offering you a fairy tale," he said, and his voice cracked like a confession. "I'm offering you my flawed heart, my broken past, my name, my future, and every version of myself I'll become if you'll let me try." He opened the box, not to reveal a diamond, but a tiny glass charm in the shape of a paintbrush, fragile and glistening like hope. "I saw you before I ever met you, in Ava's letters, in her joy, in the way your art made her want to live." His hands trembled slightly as he held the charm between them. "You didn't just teach her how to paint, you taught her how to stay. And when you walked away from me, I realized you'd done the same for me. Only I didn't deserve it then. I don't know if I do now, but I had to come, even if all you give me is silence." Ilara stared at the paintbrush, the weight of it crashing into her chest like 1,000 memories she'd locked away. No one had ever brought her something so simple, so personal, so soul-deep. Her lips parted, but no words came, only tears that fell freely, mixing with the rain. Her steps were slow, uncertain, yet unstoppable. She crossed the space between them, hands slipping around his soaked frame, as if her body remembered what her pride tried to forget. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't move. He just let her come to him, arms wrapping around her the moment her head found his chest, holding her as if letting go would destroy them both. There were no apologies that could fix the cracks, no promises that could erase the past. But as she stood there, heart pressed to his with the glass charm warming between them, she realized some things didn't need words. Sometimes love didn't arrive clean. Sometimes it showed up drenched in rain and regret, but still willing to try again. The rain eventually gave way to a city bathed in soft golden light, and in the weeks that followed, Ilara found herself not just rebuilding, but rising. Her once distant dream now breathed into life, nestled within the cobblestone heart of the city's historic district, where art lived in windows and whispers. And on the grand opening day of Monroe Gallery, the brass plaque bore her name, hers alone. Though behind every brushstroke, every curated frame, stood Grayson, who refused interviews, photo ops, or credit, choosing instead to quietly gift her the stage she'd always deserved. The gallery became a sanctuary for rising artists and forgotten voices, but peace never came without its price. The quiet was broken the morning Miranda arrived again, draped in designer grief, carrying not malice this time, but a small boy with Grayson's eyes, or so it seemed. She cornered them after an exhibit, voice trembling but deliberate, revealing a secret she'd buried for years. She had been pregnant when Grayson left her. A son, now 5. Shock carved through the room like a blade, and Grayson's face hardened, but not with fear, with resolve. He demanded the truth, demanded proof, and a DNA test followed within days, every moment waiting filled with an ache Ilara couldn't voice, even as Grayson held her hand tighter than he ever had. When the results came, the weight of deception dropped hard, not his. Miranda broke under the weight of her own lie, confessing through bitter tears that she couldn't bear watching him love another woman more honestly than he ever loved her. "I just didn't want to be forgotten," she whispered, not expecting forgiveness, not asking for it either. Grayson walked away without a word, and Ilara followed, because some ghosts don't deserve to be chased. But the week wasn't done testing them. On the gallery's most celebrated night, as guests toasted new beginnings and legacy walls, Vivian Hale collapsed near the entrance, clutching her chest with more shock than pain in her expression. Hours later, In a sterile hospital room with moonlight spilling across her aging face, Vivian beckoned Alara alone to her bedside. "I judged you," she rasped, her voice stripped of its usual frost. "Not because you weren't good enough, but because you reminded me of the woman I was before I married money and lost the pieces that made me human." For the first time, there was no armor in her tone, just the hollow echo of regret. Ilara didn't offer false comfort. She simply nodded, listening as a generation of silence cracked wide open. "You love without asking for anything," Vivian added softly, closing her eyes. "That's a rare power, Ilara. Don't lose it." She squeezed her hand, and though the gesture was faint, it was real. Ilara whispered, "I forgive you," because carrying bitterness would only weigh her down, but she also knew she'd never forget the sting of being seen as disposable. By the time Vivian was discharged, the headlines had quieted, Miranda had disappeared into her own silence, and the gallery stood tall, not as a monument to revenge or redemption, but to resurrection. Every painting on its walls told a story of being broken and rebuilt, much like the woman who now curated them. And as Grayson stood beside Alara during the gallery's third exhibit night, watching young artists beam under soft lights, he looked at her not like a prize, but like a partner, a woman who had outgrown every version of her past without losing her grace. No one in the room knew the weight of what they'd endured, and they didn't have to, because this wasn't a fairy tale tied up in ribbons and rings. This was resilience stitched with love, the kind that bled, healed, and dared to bloom again. 1 year later, as the golden hues of autumn wrapped the world in soft amber, Ilara stood beneath an ivy-draped archway in the very garden where once only rain and regret had spoken for them. Now it bloomed with second chances and the quiet miracle of survival. The leaves whispered stories above, a gentle rustle like applause from the trees. In the late afternoon sun cast a warm glow on the gathering of hearts that had witnessed their pain, endured their distance, and stayed long enough to see this. Not perfection, but peace hard-earned. Her mother, with eyes still tender from fading memory, held a sketch Alara had drawn for her as a child, clutched gently like a lifeline. Vivian Hale sat in the front row, a cane in one hand, and in the other the hand of an artist she had once tried to erase. She no longer ruled the room with arrogance, but with humility carved from her own undoing. The chairs were filled not with elites, but with people who had touched their journey. Fellow artists, gallery cleaners, Ava's favorite coffee shop owner, and strangers turned family through kindness. Ilara's gown was simple, without sequins or silk imported from far-off lands, just soft cream lace that fluttered like pages of a journal finally ending in joy. Her bouquet held no roses, only wildflowers she used to sketch in the margins of unpaid bills. Grayson stood tall at the altar in a tailored suit that bore no family crest, only a pressed handkerchief embroidered with Ava's initials. Close to his heart, always. When he looked at Alara, the room vanished because no cathedral could compare to the quiet cathedral of her eyes. And when she reached him, breathless but whole, she didn't read from a script. She simply placed her hand over his and whispered words once buried beneath pride and fear. "I finally found a home, in your arms, in your truth, in us." Grayson's reply was not loud, but it thundered in her bones. "You gave me back the pieces I didn't know I'd lost. You are my storm, my stillness, my beginning." The officiant spoke, but the world faded. Only the promise mattered, the sacred choice to walk forward, not as rescuer and rescued, but as equals rising from ruin. There were no socialites or reporters, just the hush of wind, the scent of cinnamon leaves, and laughter from the children drawing with sidewalk chalk nearby. When they kissed, it was not a grand finale, but a quiet affirmation that this love had been forged through flame and frost, shaped by loss and gilded by growth. After the ceremony, they danced barefoot in the grass to no music but memory, spinning between easels displaying her most personal paintings. One of Ava in a sunlit cafe, one of Ilara as a child dreaming beneath stars, and one of two figures standing in the rain, holding each other like shelter. The guests cheered, but their eyes only held each other. For the first time, Ilara didn't feel like a girl proving her worth. She felt like a woman who had found it, created it, and chosen love with both hands open. And Grayson, once the man with everything but peace, now held the only treasure that mattered. Not titles, not wealth, but a woman who had seen every fracture in him and kissed them into light. They didn't ride off in limousines or throw glitter into the air. They simply walked home hand in hand, two survivors who had turned grief into grace, silence into symphony. Because the truth was simple, undeniable, and eternal. She didn't just find love. She became it. And he was no longer the man who saved her. He was the one she saved right back. Together, they weren't just a couple. They were a masterpiece no storm could wash away.